My ex-husband left me for his affair partner. Now she's passed away, and he's begging to come back. But I said no, and what followed left him speechless. I'm 34, and for 8 years I thought I was living the dream with my husband Trevor. We met in college when I was studying nursing and he was working toward his engineering degree. He was charming, funny, and had this way of making me feel like I was the most important person in the world when he looked at me. We got married right after graduation and spent our 20s building what I believed was a solid foundation for our future together. Trevor landed a great job at a tech startup that specialized in renewable energy systems while I worked as a pediatric nurse at the Children's Hospital. We bought a beautiful house in the suburbs with a big backyard that we always talked about filling with kids someday. I loved our life together, the quiet Sunday mornings, the dinner parties with friends, and the way we could just sit together in comfortable silence while reading or watching movies. But looking back now, I can see the cracks that started forming around our 5th year of marriage. Trevor began working longer hours and traveling more frequently for business conferences and client meetings. He'd come home exhausted and distracted, often spending evenings on his laptop, catching up on work rather than talking with me about our days. I attributed it to the pressures of his growing career and tried to be supportive. The woman who would eventually destroy our marriage was named Stephanie, and she joined Trevor's company as a marketing director about 3 years ago. He mentioned her occasionally in passing, saying she was smart and brought fresh ideas to their campaigns. I didn't think much of it at first because Trevor had always been professional in his relationships with female colleagues, and I trusted him completely. But gradually Stephanie started appearing in more of Trevor's stories about work. He'd talk about brainstorming sessions they'd had or mention something funny she'd said during a meeting. When I suggested we invite her and her boyfriend to dinner, Trevor said she was pretty busy with work and might not have time for social gatherings. That should have been my first warning sign. The real red flags started appearing last spring when Trevor's behavior began changing in ways that were impossible to ignore. He became secretive about his phone, always keeping it face down and taking calls in other rooms. He started showering immediately when he came home from work and bought new clothes without mentioning it. Most telling of all, he stopped talking about our future plans and seemed distant even when we were physically together. I tried addressing my concerns directly by asking if everything was okay between us. Trevor would insist that nothing had changed and that he was just stressed about work projects and company deadlines. He'd accuse me of being paranoid and suggest that maybe I was looking for problems where none existed. His gaslighting was so subtle and consistent that I started questioning my own perceptions. The discovery came in the most cliché way possible when Trevor left his laptop open while he went to take a shower. I wasn't intentionally snooping, but a message notification popped up that made my blood run cold. It was from Stephanie saying, "I can't wait to hold you again tonight," followed by a heart emoji. My hands were shaking as I scrolled through months of intimate messages between them. The messages revealed that their affair had been going on for over a year and was far more serious than just physical attraction. They talked about being soulmates and how they'd never felt love like this before. Stephanie wrote about how she was ready to leave her boyfriend, and Trevor responded that he was working up the courage to end our marriage. They'd been planning their future together while I was completely oblivious. When I confronted Trevor with the evidence that evening, he didn't even try to deny it. He said he'd fallen in love with Stephanie and that he couldn't pretend to be happy in our marriage anymore. He claimed that what they had was different from what we'd shared and that he needed to follow his heart even if it meant hurting me. The casual way he destroyed 8 years of marriage was almost more shocking than the affair itself. Trevor moved out within a week and filed for divorce immediately. He said he wanted to start his new life with Stephanie as quickly as possible and that dragging out the legal process would just make everything more painful for everyone involved. I was so devastated and overwhelmed that I barely fought for anything in the settlement. I just wanted the nightmare to end so I could begin healing. The divorce was finalized 6 months later, and Trevor wasted no time making his relationship with Stephanie official. Within weeks of our papers being signed, they were posting photos together on social media, looking blissfully happy and completely in love. Seeing them together was like watching someone else live the life I'd thought was mine, especially when they started doing activities and visiting places that had been special to Trevor and me. Stephanie moved into the house that Trevor and I had shared, the home where we'd planned to raise children and grow old together. She redecorated everything, erasing any trace of my 8-year presence there. Through mutual friends, I heard that she'd thrown out wedding photos and gifts from our marriage, like she was determined to pretend I'd never existed in Trevor's life. The most painful part was watching Trevor become the husband to Stephanie that I'd always wished he could be for me. He posted romantic gestures on social media, surprise weekend getaways, flowers delivered to her office, and elaborate date nights that he'd never planned during our marriage. It was like seeing a completely different version of the man I'd loved, and it made me question whether he'd ever really been invested in our relationship. They got engaged after dating for only 8 months, with Trevor proposing during a trip to Paris that he'd always promised to take with me but never found time for. The engagement photos showed Stephanie wearing a massive diamond ring that was significantly more expensive than the modest band Trevor had given me. Everything about their relationship seemed designed to highlight how much more he valued her than he'd ever valued me. The wedding planning was all over Stephanie's social media accounts, with posts about dress shopping, venue visits, and tasting menus at exclusive restaurants. She seemed determined to have the fairy tale wedding that every woman dreams of, complete with destination bachelor and bachelorette parties and a guest list full of influencers and celebrities from Trevor's expanded social circle. They married exactly 18 months after our divorce was finalized in a lavish ceremony at a resort in Hawaii. The photos showed Trevor looking happier than I'd ever seen him during our entire marriage. He gazed at Stephanie like she was his entire world, and the love between them was undeniable, even to someone like me who'd been deeply hurt by their betrayal. For a while it seemed like Trevor had gotten everything he'd wanted. He had the passionate love affair that he'd claimed was missing from our marriage, along with a wife who shared his ambitions for a glamorous lifestyle. Stephanie quit her job to focus on building her social media presence as an influencer, while Trevor's career continued advancing rapidly. But about 2 years into their marriage, cracks started showing in their perfect facade. Stephanie began posting less frequently, and when she did share content, it was often cryptic quotes about facing challenges and staying strong during difficult times. She looked thinner in photos, and there were gaps in their usual stream of romantic couple content. Through our remaining mutual friends, I learned that Stephanie had been diagnosed with an aggressive form of breast cancer. She was only 31 years old and had no family history of the disease. The diagnosis was devastating, not just because of her age, but because the cancer had already spread by the time doctors discovered it. Trevor threw himself into supporting Stephanie through her treatment, paying for the best oncologists and experimental therapies money could buy. He took extended leave from work to be with her during chemotherapy sessions and documented their journey on social media with posts about fighting together and never giving up hope. But despite their efforts and determination, Stephanie's condition continued deteriorating. The treatments that were supposed to save her life were harsh and debilitating. The vibrant, confident woman who'd stolen my husband became frail and weak, struggling with pain that no amount of love or money could fix. Stephanie passed away on a Tuesday morning in March after fighting cancer for 18 months. She was surrounded by family and friends, including Trevor, who held her hand as she took her final breath. The funeral was beautiful but heartbreaking, with hundreds of people celebrating a life that had been cut tragically short. 3 months after Stephanie's funeral, Trevor reached out to me for the first time since our divorce proceedings. His initial contact was a simple text message asking if we could talk because he needed to tell me something important. I was surprised to hear from him, but curious about what could be so urgent that he'd break years of silence between us. When I agreed to meet him for coffee, I was shocked by how much he'd changed. The confident, successful man I'd once been married to looked exhausted and hollow, like he'd aged a decade in the past few years. His clothes hung loosely on his frame, and there were dark circles under his eyes that suggested he hadn't been sleeping well for months. Trevor started the conversation by apologizing for how our marriage had ended and acknowledging that he'd handled everything badly. He said that losing Stephanie had given him perspective on what really mattered in life and that he'd been thinking about our relationship differently. He claimed that the stability and comfort we'd shared was actually more valuable than the passion he'd chased with his affair. As we talked, it became clear that Trevor was struggling with profound grief and loneliness. He'd built his entire life around Stephanie, and her death had left him with no sense of purpose or direction. He talked about feeling lost and disconnected from everything that had once mattered to him. It was obvious that he was in tremendous emotional pain. Then Trevor made the request that I'd never expected to hear. He asked if there was any chance we could reconcile and try to rebuild what we'd once had together. He said he realized now that our marriage had been good and that he'd thrown away something precious for a fantasy that couldn't last. He wanted to know if I could ever forgive him and give our relationship another chance. I listened to his entire speech without interrupting, but inside I was processing a mixture of emotions. Part of me felt genuine sympathy for his loss because I could see how much he was suffering. But another part of me was incredulous that he thought he could simply return to me now that his first choice was no longer available. Trevor seemed to interpret my silence as consideration rather than shock. He continued explaining how much he'd grown during his time with Stephanie and how her death had taught him to appreciate the kind of steady, loving partnership we'd shared. He said he was a different person now, someone who would never take our relationship for granted again. The more he talked, the more I realized that Trevor still didn't understand what he'd done wrong. He was framing our potential reconciliation as him graciously returning to me rather than acknowledging that he'd destroyed something irreplaceable. He seemed to think that his suffering had somehow earned him the right to reclaim the life he'd abandoned. When he finally finished talking, Trevor looked at me expectantly, like he genuinely believed I might say yes to his proposal. The hope in his eyes was almost heartbreaking because it was clear he had no idea how his request sounded to someone who'd spent years rebuilding her life after his betrayal. I took a deep breath and told Trevor that while I was sorry for his loss, I had no interest in reconciling our relationship. I explained that I'd worked hard to heal from the trauma of his affair and divorce, and that I'd built a new life that I was happy with. I said that what we'd had was over and could never be recovered, no matter how much he might want it back. Trevor's reaction was immediate shock followed by desperate pleading. He said I didn't understand how much he'd changed and how different things would be if we tried again. He promised that he'd never hurt me again and that he'd spend the rest of his life making up for his mistakes. He begged me to at least consider giving him a chance to prove himself. But I remained firm in my decision. I told Trevor that some bridges couldn't be rebuilt once they'd been burned and that our marriage was one of them. I wished him well in his healing process, but made it clear that it would have to happen without me. The conversation ended with Trevor looking devastated, but finally understanding that I meant what I said. Over the next few weeks, Trevor continued reaching out through texts and voicemails, becoming increasingly desperate in his attempts to change my mind. He sent flowers to my workplace with notes about second chances and hired a therapist who specialized in helping couples recover from infidelity. He even reached out to my family members, trying to convince them to intervene on his behalf. The final straw came when Trevor showed up at my house unannounced on a Saturday morning, looking disheveled and frantic. He said he couldn't accept my rejection and that he knew deep down I still had feelings for him. He claimed that our connection had been too strong to disappear completely and that we owed it to ourselves to try again. That's when I realized I needed to tell Trevor the truth about why reconciliation was completely impossible. I invited him inside and made coffee while gathering the courage to share something I'd never told anyone, not even my closest friends or family members. It was time for him to understand exactly what his betrayal had cost me. I started by telling Trevor that his affair had damaged me in ways he'd never understood or acknowledged. I explained that discovering his deception had shattered my ability to trust not just him, but my own judgment about people and relationships. The trauma of his betrayal had required years of therapy to overcome, and I was still working on rebuilding my confidence in my own perceptions. But then I revealed the information that would change everything he thought he knew about our situation. I told Trevor that I'd been seeing someone for the past year and that our relationship was serious enough that we were discussing marriage. I explained that I'd found love again with someone who valued me completely and would never betray my trust the way Trevor had. The shock on Trevor's face was immediate and profound as he realized I wasn't still pining for our lost relationship. I was actively building a new life with someone else, someone who appreciated what Trevor had thrown away. His assumption that I'd been waiting for him to come back was revealed as the self-centered fantasy it had always been. Then I delivered the final blow that left Trevor completely speechless. I told him that my new partner was actually someone he knew well, David, who had been his best friend since college and the best man at our wedding. David had been there for me during the darkest period of my life, offering support and friendship when I felt completely alone and betrayed. I explained that David had always believed Trevor was making a terrible mistake by leaving me for Stephanie. He'd been quietly furious about the affair and had reached out to check on me after the divorce was finalized. What started as friendship had gradually developed into something deeper as we realized we shared values and life goals that made us incredibly compatible. David had proposed to me just 2 weeks before Stephanie's death, though we'd kept our engagement private out of respect for the grieving process. We were planning a small, intimate wedding for later in the year with only close family and friends in attendance. Unlike Trevor's relationship with Stephanie, our love was built on a foundation of mutual respect and genuine compatibility. The revelation that his former best friend was now my fiancé was devastating to Trevor on multiple levels. Not only had he lost any chance of reconciliation with me, but he'd also lost one of his oldest friendships. David had made it clear that he couldn't maintain a relationship with someone who treated me so badly and had cut ties with Trevor completely. Trevor sat in stunned silence for several minutes, processing the information I'd shared. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper as he asked how long David and I had been together. I told him the truth about our timeline and watched as he realized that while he'd been building his dream life with Stephanie, I'd been building mine with someone who truly appreciated me. The conversation ended with Trevor leaving my house looking completely defeated. He finally understood that his chance for reconciliation had never existed because I'd already moved on in the most complete way possible. Not only had I healed from his betrayal, but I'd found happiness with someone who would never hurt me the way he had. Over the following months, Trevor stopped reaching out entirely. Through mutual acquaintances, I heard that he'd eventually accepted a job transfer to another state and was trying to rebuild his life somewhere new. He'd finally realized that the past couldn't be recovered and that some choices have consequences that last forever. As for me, I married David in a beautiful ceremony surrounded by people who'd supported us through our individual struggles and celebrated our happiness together. Our relationship was everything my marriage to Trevor had never been, built on genuine partnership, mutual respect, and unwavering loyalty. Trevor's betrayal had ultimately led me to find the love I'd always deserved but never experienced until David showed me what real commitment looked like. Looking back, I'm grateful that Trevor's affair happened when it did rather than years later when we might have had children together. His selfishness and lack of commitment would have eventually surfaced in other ways, and I'm better off having learned about his character before we'd built an even more complicated life together. Sometimes the worst betrayals lead to the best outcomes if you're willing to do the work to heal and grow from the experience.